What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, we're going to be diving into what we kind of learned from this weekend's Pro Tour event that they held online on the official Magic the Gathering Twitch channel. I think you could have caught some of the coverage or the main games they were focusing on, but I kind of want to show you like how the meta broke down, what decks were outperforming, what was the breakdown of the meta, like who was playing what, how much percentage of each deck. So this deck is kind of like the post bans, you know, the dust has settled. These are what like pro players are bringing to the table when it comes to playing Magic the Gathering in more of a competitive format. There are certain decks that really stand out and how much they are being played. I don't know if it's because the deck just overall, regardless of even if it falls off, like this deck is like the main deck has been around for a while. It just kind of came back into resurgence just because certain things got removed from the format, which then just kind of like brings this deck just to the forefront just because the deck works. That's the thing, the deck works as long as you draw a couple pieces. But overall, the list here is actually kind of surprising because before we get into it, majority of what's on this list is in some form of way a control format in a way. Majority of the decks are control based. They kind of control the board. Either you ramp up into something and do stuff, or you just kind of control the board until you get your end game out against your opponent. I don't know exactly how all the games played out, how certain matchups did against certain matchups, but there is a clear winner of how much of one deck was played. There is also the mono red splash in here as the only aggro deck in the top 5 of most played decks. But overall, the deck list is actually quite surprising. Like I said, there's two decks that I think people expected to see here. A couple maybe in the middle there. Even with the nerfs to companions, there's still a companion deck or two out there in the meta, so that's actually pretty cool. But overall, guys, let's dive into it. Let's figure out, you know, what each deck contains of, and if you like this video, hit that like button. If you want to see more videos, hit the subscribe button. But let's dive into the meta breakdown. So what I want to do first is kind of take a quick look at the breakdown of the metagame summary of how much percentage of each of these decks that I'm going to be listed in this video were played in the actual event. Kind of go through each one and give you guys examples of each deck list there. So right off the bat, you can kind of already see in day one of the meta, there's one deck that stands out as almost half the field is playing, and that is Temur Reclamation. 79 people that participated in this event on day one were playing this deck. It changes a little bit on day two, which I have the tab open up in the top, so I will flip over after I go through that. So Temur Reclamation is the top deck that majority of people are playing. This is a deck that's been around. Everyone knows this deck. It's really good because you just, mana doesn't matter. You just play a bunch of you play a bunch of Reclamations on the battlefield. Hopefully get, you know, 7-8 lands out, and then enough, and then wait for an end step, tap it all down, you know, do an explosion to your opponent's face and win there. And there's good spot removal too that kind of lets you get to that point of where you're able to get advantage of the game. Addition of Shark Typhoon also makes this deck really good because you just play really big sharks with cycling, and or you can even play the Shark Typhoon on the battlefield into play. So Temur Reclamation makes sense as it being one of the top decks, and it's been proven that in a best of 3 format, Temur Reclamation is fairly strong. Next up is another one that you may have seen, especially if you play ranked, is the Jund Sacrifice deck, which is a deck that focuses around creating food tokens with Mayhem Devils, Corvos, Cats. It's kind of like the breakdown, it's kind of the mixture of like the Rakdos with like food and stuff and sacrifice and to do damage to your opponent's face. Just creating a problem for your opponent that they really can't deal with. If they can't get rid of anything in the graveyard, prevent you from playing anything in the graveyard, Jund Sacrifice is that deck. I don't know if it's as good as like the Temur Reclamation, but it's that annoying kind of deck that you'll probably see in the meta. The breakdown probably is a little bit different in like the best of 1 style, but in a best of 3 style, Jund Sacrifice is another deck that's, you know, pretty interesting. Then you got the Bant Ramp, which is like a simple Bant Ramp deck where the goal is to ramp up into a lot of mana to play a lot of spells. I believe the deck contains Yorion, so you can kind of like do trigger flickers and stuff like that. You still play Teferis and things like that. You pretty much, it's like a control deck with Uros, Teferis, things to ramp up into more lands, you know, just drawing cards and just getting a ton of lands on the battlefield. So it's kind of cool to see like a control-y Bant. I mean, I call it a Bant Ramp, but I would say it's like more of like a Bant control deck with ramp as an added benefit, so you can just play more of your spells against your opponent and hopefully win the game that way. Then you go next is the Sultai Ramp, which is pretty much the same concept, but in the adds black instead of white. and pretty much overall same concept. Without, I don't think Yorian's played in this version. I did import the list into my thing, so we'll go into each of those decks and break them down. But Sultai Ramp is another control based deck where you kind of want to control your opponent and overall just kind of like control the battlefield. And the other thing too is if you see like Temur Reclamation 79 total people, Jund Sacrifice only 30 people, Bant Ramp only 17, Sultai 14, and surprisingly mono reds here at 3.5 at 7 total people playing it. And mono red is a simple mono red. You get annexes, you get Torbrands, you get Embercleaves. Just try to hit your opponent quicker than they can get board presence, and if you do that, you hopefully win the game. In a best of 3 format, I don't know how good that is, just because there's ways these decks in the meta control wise can get things out into their decks to kind of slow these aggro decks down. Because the thing is, if you exhaust a lot of your stuff early game against these control decks, it makes it tough for you to regain, especially if they wipe the board or something like that. So mono red a little bit not represented, and then there's a whole other breakdown of, you know, Azorius Control, Jeskai Luca, a whole bunch of other decks that I guess aren't in a meta style, maybe more janky. Mono red Cavalcade, Gruul, White Black Red, Esper, Temur Adventures, so on and so forth. But majority of these other decks are just like a sprinkle of a couple people, sprinkle of a couple people kind of thing. And you know, there's definitely one thing that I would say is that usually like the top like 3-ish to 5 are typically like the decks that really break down the meta. And also, as another side note, this doesn't mean these are the best decks also in best of 1. So even if you come to like, you know, you find these lists online or whatever and import them into MTG Arena, it doesn't mean that you're going to definitely win a game 1. These decks are built for the best of 3. Typically that's how competitive Magic is played, so just as best of 3 as a side note. So I am going to put a list down at the bottom for these decks if you want to take a look for each one. But let's move on to day 2 and just kind of see how things shift a little bit. Nothing really drastically changes. Nothing really gets bumped out of the top 5 when it comes to what decks are being played. But some of the percentages shift around, I guess, based on what people are bringing, maybe after what they learned from day 1. So into day 2. So like I said before, day 2, nothing really changes too much. Still, 30% of the field is playing Temur Reclamation. They only lose like 5 people actually playing the deck. Actually, I think there's also more decks listed on day 2, so more people played day 2 than they did play day 1. So 74 people are playing Temur Reclamation, 33 people playing Jund Sacrifice. Sultai Ramp makes a little bump up at 30 people playing it, so it actually bumps ahead of Bant Ramp. Bant Ramp it then falls into 4th with 25 people, Mono Red with 13, roughly about the same 5%, and then kind of like the Jeskai Luca, and then a whole bunch of other assorted decks that you may have seen in the arena. But like I said, the top 5 really didn't change. It just maybe Sultai and Bant Ramp kind of shifted just based on maybe what people were feeling out on day 1. But overall, I mean, Temur Reclamation is still dominating the amount of people playing it. It is, like I said, probably the most solid deck out there, especially in a best of 3 format. Maybe not good against like the aggro-ish decks initially if you can get a lot of damage on a Temur Reclamation deck before they really set up themselves. But once they get into sideboard and get the cards that will slow down a aggro deck, Temur Reclamation definitely does become a problem in the meta. So to break down the deck list, we're going to start off with mono red just because it is the bottom of the bottom. Everyone knows this deck list. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, I know countless times I've played the arena, and this is the deck list that I feel like a lot of people play in the best of 1. Just because it's a very solid deck list, especially when your opponent can't sideboard cards out. But it's the same deck list for the most part, maybe a couple tweaks here and there. This is also a sample deck list. Maybe some other people who ran this list at this event may have played a little extra of this, a little fewer of this. This, I guess, just breaks down all the averages of everything, kind of puts them in the deck and calls it a day. So I just use that as this deck list. So to start it off, it's Fervent Champion. It's the straightforward standard card that you would see in this deck. You know, he's the 1/1 with haste, first strike. You have multiples of these out, it becomes a problem just because it can become 2/1s. You can also give, you know, you can also equip things for 3 less, so just in case something gets, you know, that has your Embercleave gets killed, you can also put Embercleave on it for free, I believe. Scorch Bitter, because, you know, it's good. Every time it attacks, it definitely does at least that 1 damage. With the Torbran on the battlefield, that becomes 3, and then on top of that, it's just really good. Shock for some spot removal, especially if your opponent's also playing something aggro-esque or just early game. You can also shock them in the face, or just get that little bit of extra damage, like you cast a shock on something that may be bigger than a Fervent Champion, so you get the toughness down lower, and then you pretty much Forever Champion First Strike actually then finishes it off. 10 Street Dodgers for the defender. You know, it can't be blocked except by creatures with defender, which is very, very good against like control decks that play like, you know, just bigger things. Robber the Rich, another solid card because it's 2 cost with reach, has the ability to pretty much draw the top card of your opponent's library. If it's not a land card, you get to put it in your hand essentially, and then be able to cast that spell even if you don't have the colors to play it. We're naming Steamkin just because +1/+1 counters are solid, and you can remove 3 counters from it and get additional mana, which if done right and you have the right hand, you can pretty much almost get like this hand where you just are able to play everything, and it's too much for your opponent, and you can pretty much do like a 1 turn like swing for lethal if you do everything right. Annex because he protects all your creatures, because when if they die, you get satyrs. If he dies and he's above 4, or any of your creatures are above 4, you know, you get 2 satyrs for that. It's just like a good solid way that they have to exile it if they don't want you to get satyrs. In some sort of way, usually you get satyrs even if they shock it or do something with it. You know, Annex is just a solid card, and the fact that it has devotion to red, the deck is a red deck, so he's definitely at least a 2/3 when he comes on the battlefield. You have no other devotion, and usually he's a lot bigger. It's a good Embercleave target to then pretty much swing out your opponent's face and maybe finish the game. Bonecrusher Giant because it's a two effect card. You can shock something for 2 and it can't be prevented, or you can, you know, play it for its 4/3 ability, and then if they try to target it with a spell, it's going to do 2 damage back to their face. Also, side note, it does it to you as well. I feel like I've said this before, maybe one of my previous mono red decks, but this is that, you know, it's good protection, and it's a 4/3 body, which for 3 mana is very, very solid. Light the stage because this is the way that red decks work. If you get light the stage very early, you get just a few extra cards, especially if you do damage like on turn 2, turn 3, you get those 2 extra cards. You know, you may draw your Embercleave, Torbrand, a land card that you may be looking for to get to that Torbrand or Embercleave. Pretty much adds them to your hand, but they can't be targeted by any discard spells, so definitely a good solid card just to draw some extra cards. Torbrand, like I said before, because he makes all our red sources do additional 2 damage instead, on top of their normal damage. So that's also really good. Embercleave, because this is the way you finish the game most of the time. You swing in with like 3-4 things. Embercleave costs 1 less for each attacking creature control. If you bring in Embercleave for 3, 2, 4 mana, and gives that creature +1/+1 double strike and trample. I feel like, you know, this list hasn't really changed too much. Some people may run Infuriate, some people may run things to pump up things, but you know, for the most part, this is the general like mono red list that you see in the arena. Castle Embereth, just because it pumps up our board, allows us to kind of maybe get that additional point of damage that we may need to get our opponent just that little bit lower. And Mountain just to, you know, 18 mountains to finish it out. But this is pretty much the solid mono red list that everyone's seen, everyone's played against, everyone maybe even plays. Not going to judge you if you play mono red, but this is mono red. So moving on to the next deck. All right, so moving on to the next deck, we have the Sultai Ramp / Sultai Control, I like to call it, just because as much as it ramps up in lands, the goal here is to get a lot of lands out so you can kind of control out your opponent. You play creatures more than maybe the control deck would. You play Uros, you play Hydroids, you play Shark Typhoons, things like that to get like some presence on the board against your opponent. But the goal here really is to pretty much control the board out, get what you want on the battlefield, get rid of the things your opponents are playing, get rid of a couple engines, look at their hands, maybe get rid of something in their hands or graveyard. A little bit of graveyard hate, a little bit of, you know, that spot hate based on what the meta is breaking down to. So let's get into the list and kind of break it down. So we got the Soul Guide Lantern, which is a good solid card because you can exile target card from graveyard, you can sacrifice it, exile each opponent's graveyard. So if you want to get rid of their graveyard as a whole, if they're playing a lot of stuff that comes back from the graveyard that you're playing against, maybe like one of those Jund decks with like cats and stuff like that, or anything with a graveyard that has a lot of hate, maybe playing against a mirror or another deck that's playing Uro, this gets rid of their Uro. You can also sacrifice it for 1 and tap it, and you can also draw a card. So very solid like graveyard removal just to kind of have. Pretty cool just because it's main deck. Usually this is in like most sideboards, but because the way I guess the meta broken down based on the sample list, I guess this list in general, they ran a little bit of that sideboard stuff just because they assumed that they'd run into some sort of graveyard deck, just because like for example in the arena there's a lot of people playing the Rakdos or the Jund Food decks out there, so maybe they just added it just because they were expecting a lot of that matchup. Either Gus, yet again another solid way to get rid of any of the mono red threats, get rid of any green threats, so anything that even splashes like Uros and stuff like that, you can get rid of your opponent's green or red stuff. You can also target it as a spell, so if they cast it, you can actually choose to put it, you can pretty much counter it in a way, or at least delay it a turn, so pretty much makes your opponent make the decision if they want to redraw that card the following turn or put on the bottom and, you know, move on with the turn. Definitely solid card. Agonize and Remorse, just as a look at their hand, do you see anything that you don't like? You make them exile it. You may take 1 life. Also, the other side fact is if you don't have like your Soul Guy Lantern, they have something in the graveyard that you just don't like, and you just feel like they're gonna get it back, you can also target something in their graveyard and they exile it as well. The difference here, other than like maybe a Thought Erasure, is that this card's exiled. It's not you know, discarded. So that's the one difference. So then they completely can't bring it back in any form. So that's the one difference between this and Thought Erasure. The one downfall is you take 1 life, but I think in a control deck you're not really worried about it. Your goal here is to pretty much control your opponent's hand, if not their board as well. Then there's some will. This is here just because, yet again, Jund Food, anything artifact, Ember Cleave is very solid. We don't have to worry about fires as much anymore. If there's the Yorion deck out there, they do play a lot of enchantments. So you can get rid of someone's enchantment so they can't scry. Temur Reclamation's another thing, so you can get rid of their Reclamation. And if all said and done, if they're not really playing any of that stuff, you can always cycle it for 2. So it's a 2-cost cycle card, you know, 2-cost draw card, which isn't terrible and it can't be countered. And or it's there for utility to get rid of certain threats on the board. Because it's a ramp deck, we are running Growth Spiral. It runs green and blue. So draw a card, you get to put a land card, additional land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Very solid card. It's in every single like deck that any Simic, any deck that runs blue and green, you're probably more than likely gonna run Growth Spiral just because it's so good for the cost of 2. Mystical Dispute, you never know. It's the only counter in the deck. Maybe you're against an opponent who's also playing blue, so this definitely counters anything that they play. Because then this spell only costs 1, as well as worst case scenario, you can always pay for this full 3 and counter target spell unless their opponent plays 3 mana. I mean, here's the other thing too. Like, even if you don't counter something, they may have enough mana. You can also tax them in a way, so they play a spell that may cost 4 or 5. You counter it, they have maybe the 3 mana open, they pay it, but in a way they just spent the rest of their mana on that turn. Even if they maybe not, we're gonna have another play. They are now tapped down, and now you have an ability to maybe try to react a different way. Uro, because he's just so good, he can escape. He can, whenever he comes into the battlefield, you know, he gives you 3 life. You get to draw a card. If it's a land card, you get to put on the battlefield. Yeah, just a solid 6/6, and whenever he attacks, the effect triggers again. You know, a couple of these guys in the graveyard. He's just overall a very solid utility card for a cost of 3. I mean, he doesn't have trample, but I don't really think the ability to ramp and gain some life and draw a card, overall this card is just really good. Extinction Event, this is like the first kind of control card that I've kind of gone over, other than the Agonize and Remorse and stuff. Extinction Event is another solid card. I think it's been seeing a lot more play because this is one of those things. You can choose odd or even, so if your opponent's playing a lot of like 2, 4, 6 drops creatures, you can choose evens. If they're playing a lot of 1, 3s, and 5s, you can choose odds. Tokens count as 0, so 0 is even. So if they're playing a lot of tokens, you can run an Extinction Event and just wipe out all their tokens. And they're exiled, they don't go to the graveyard, so there's no way of them ever getting it back. So especially in a very aggressive aggro matchup, like, you can definitely wipe out their board. Definitely a cool card that I think is going to see a lot more play just because of its utility. You can kind of build around it as well. Like, for example, I think looking at this list, I don't think any of our creatures, other than maybe Hydroid, is really a 2, and our Uro is a 3. So worst case scenario, you may have to sacrifice one of them if you really want to wipe out your opponent's board, if the board just becomes too wide for you. But for a 4 cost to exile, you know, odd or even cards, it's definitely solid. Tamiyo, because this pretty much shuts down all the Jund decks, and your opponent can't make you discard cards, which is definitely very solid. But it's really just to prevent your opponents from playing their Priests of the Forgotten Gods on you and making you sacrifice. Just because our board threats aren't very wide, we play very singular target like board threats, so definitely a card that pretty much stops those from happening. We can +1. We can look at the top card. We choose a non-land card, reveal the top 4 cards of our library, put all of the name into our hand, the rest in our graveyard. Which, if we're really looking for something, like we're looking for that Extinction Event, we're looking for that Uro, we can put Uro in, even if we don't know, and we can try our best to hopefully draw it. Worst case scenario, it doesn't happen, it goes in our graveyard. We can always -3 on Tamiya, and we can get back a card that we may need and replay it against our opponents. So let's just say our Extinction Event gets put into the graveyard, we can always bring Extinction Event back and allow ourselves to then play it when we need it. We can, you know, we can get back a Casualties of War, a Shark Typhoon, another Planeswalker. Just so the ability to pick something out of the graveyard and bring it back into your hand and just allow you to recast it is definitely solid. And then we will move on to Nissa, just because she's also super duper strong. I feel like she kind of fell off for a little bit just because of the way the format was with the Agents of Treachery and stuff like that. But this is a very solid card. She's been solid for the longest time. She's a 5-cost 5 loyalty Planeswalker that makes us allows our green mana to be a tap for additional green mana, as well as she then puts +1/+1 counters on target land we control. It has vigilance and haste, and it's still a land, so pretty much she creates more bodies on the battlefield. And if we get to our -8, we pretty much search our land, our library for all our forest cards, put them on the battlefield tapped, and all our lands are now indestructible. So if we have a lot of forest creatures that are now on the battlefield, we can just attack in. They're indestructible. But the ability that she makes us produce additional mana, and the fact that she makes our lands into threats, is one of the reasons why she's so good for the cost that she is. Then you got Shark Typhoon, another solid card here. It's good for the cycling. Usually this is where we're going to use it, just to tap the 2 and cycle for X. And worst case scenario, I don't really see in this deck, for example, I don't see us playing it for its 6 cost on the battlefield, and when we play non-creature spell, we're going to make tokens. I mean, a worst case scenario, maybe this is all we've drawn, and you feel like you just need something, you maybe have another thing to play, you can maybe put this on the field, play that. But I would say the cycling is just super duper strong. We can cycle, like I said, cycle for X, and that shark that comes on the battlefield as a block, and I just realized becomes an XX based on the number we tapped. So definitely a solid card. I think most controlled decks run Shark Typhoon just for its cycling ability to create creatures that could flash in, that can't be countered, and block your opponent's creatures. Casualties of War, I mean, what Sultai deck would not run Casualties of War? It's pretty much, hey, I get to target one of each of these categories based on what my opponent has. I mean, it's the perfect spot removal, especially when they're running a little bit of everything, like a Jund Food, for example. You can target artifact, you can target creature, you can target enchantment, you can target land, you can target planeswalker. So like in the example in Jund Food, you can definitely get 4 of these abilities based on what they may have. 4/6 mana to do this kind of like spot removal. It's definitely a good card, I think. I feel like this is another card that was running around before like agent decks became a problem, but definitely a good solid card just for that perfect spot removal. And then Hydroid, because we're ramping up, why not have something to gain ourselves some life as well as draw some cards. And then he comes into the battlefield, he's flying, he's trample, he could close out the game, especially if your opponent's starting to get low. Definitely a solid card in that effect. And then the lands is pretty straightforward. For a control deck, it runs quite a few lands: 2 swamps, 1 island, or 2 islands, 1 swamp, 2 forests, 4 watery graves, 4 overgrown tombs, 1 temple of Milady, 4 breeding pools, 1 temple of mystery, 4 Zagoth triomes, 1 blast zone, and 4 fabled passages. The breakdown is pretty good for a control deck. We average around 3, a little bit over 3, 28 lands, and a lot of stuff to play. So 7 creatures, 25 non-creatures, so majority spells here. But overall, this deck is fairly strong. Like I said, this may not translate well into a best of 1, so if you did copy this list and try to run in the best of 1, you may have to make a few tweaks, just because the meta is definitely different in a best of 1 format than a best of 3. But overall, a very solid, strong deck in this particular format. All right, now moving on to the next deck. Back to another ramp deck. We are running the Bant Ramp, so we exchange swamps for plains to now pretty much get some other cards that we can't play in the Sultai Ramp in this deck. So it's pretty much the same thing. Run some Aether Gust to pretty much prevent red and green spells from staying on the battlefield or delay them a turn. Dovin's Veto for that quick, can't be countered counter spells. So if our opponent's playing Temur Reclamation, we can counter maybe their explosion to our face, and they can't counter it from countering their reclamation, or not the reclamation, their explosion. Growth Spiral, because yet again we play blue-green, gotta run the Growth Spiral for the ramp. Narset to slow our opponent down from drawing cards. We only and we can also, you know, -2 and look at the top 4 cards and reveal a non-creature card. This deck was mostly non-creature cards, and get maybe the thing we're looking for, whether it's a counter or it's looking for something that to kind of deal with something that may be on the battlefield, or just hold for later in the game when we may need it. Neutralize, another solid counter spell. We can also tap 2 to cycle it if we really don't feel like our opponent's playing too much. We can cycle it and draw a card if we really need to. Teferi to stop our opponent from also Temur Reclamation, from playing Explosion at the end of their turn, because Teferi just prevents any instance from being played outside your opponent's actual turn. So that's definitely solid. We can +1. We can make our sorceries be played at instant speed, as well as we can -3 and just bounce something back to our opponent's hand. If we want to slow them down or make them repay it, kind of tax them to have to play something a second time, especially if they have a big threat on the battlefield. Or maybe, like, for example, they play an Uro Escape from the graveyard, and then they only have it bounce back to their hand, and they have to play it, get it sacrificed, and then they pretty much have to escape it another time. That could actually slow them down. As much as they may gain all that life, it's something that you could consider doing. Uro, because yet again, it's another ramp deck. So Uro is here just because of its ability to ramp up, as well as gain some life and escape from the graveyard, worst case scenario. Shadow the Sky just as that 1/of to wipe the board from creatures. This list, I guess, had an idea that the field was gonna be more control based than aggro, so they only run 1/of. But it's a very solid board wipe for the cost of 4, and if a opponent has something that's 4 or greater, they get to draw a card. But other than that, it's a very solid board wipe. Tamio, yet again, like I said before, she's good in the fact that she pretty much doesn't allow your things to be sacrificed and or make you discard. Your opponent can't make you discard cards. You get to try to test your luck and look at the top 4 cards of your library and name a card and put it into your hand. Worst case scenario, if you strike out, you can always -3 and get that stuff back from your graveyard get that card back to your graveyard to your hand. Especially if something got discarded or from this ability, you can always get it back. Elspeth, because Elspeth Conqueror's Death is like one of the better 5 drops, especially in the meta, just because it makes all our opponent's non-creature spells cost 2 more on its second time, exiles something on its first time out, and best case scenario too, you can always get back a Planeswalker from your graveyard with a +1/+1 and or loyalty counter on it. So if any of our Planeswalkers go to the graveyard, we can always get them back. This deck doesn't really run any creatures other than Uro, so getting like an Uro back from the graveyard with this ability is not the benefit, just because Uro gets sacrificed again because it has to escape in order to not get sacrificed. But Elspeth Conqueror's Death is a solid card just regardless, because the ability to have all these effects happen for 3 turns is definitely solid. And also the second ability just slows down your opponent's control decks. Nissa, because yet again Nissa is Nissa. She makes all our lands become creatures, and all our green mana produce additional spells, which in a ramp deck allows us to play more things. Definitely gives us more to tap X for Shark Typhoon. Also allows us to play our bigger spells like a Plenar Cleansing, which just kind of wipes our opponent's, destroys all non-land permanents, even ours, but it pretty much just wipes the board out. If there's something on the board that we just don't want, or our opponent's board presence is a lot better than ours, maybe they're more set up for like a Temur Reclamation, maybe they have 3 reclamations on the battlefield, I don't know. But Plenar Cleanse is another solid card. Strike Typhoon, like I said, maybe in this deck just because it plays less creatures, maybe we play it on the battlefield for the 6, but majority of the time, especially in the early game, especially if our opponent's playing something more aggro based, we are going to tap it for its X and 2 cost to cycle. Ugin, just because it's another solid card, it allows our colorless spells to cost 2 less to play, but I don't think that's really the ability. But the ability here is we can also +1, and we can put we make a 2/2 spirit creature with a card from the top of our library, and when that creature dies, we get to add it to our hand, and then -3 we can destroy target permanent that's 1 or more colors. So if our opponent's playing a lot of multicolor spells, if they're playing like another multicolor deck like the Sultai or the Mirror, or I don't think Temur Reclamation really plays anything multicolored permanent, but if anyone's playing a multicolored permanent, he can destroy target multicolored permanent, just get off the battlefield. And then yet again, because it's control deck, we run a lot of lands, 2 plains, 1 castle to scry, 2 islands, 2 forests, 2 hollow fountains, 4 temple of enlightenments to scry on the top of the library, 3 temple gardens, 1 temple of plenty, 3 vision pools, 3 temple of masteries, 1 blast zone, and 4 fabled passages to fix our mana. But overall, this is the Bant Ramp deck. Like I said, it's pretty much similar to the Sultai Ramp deck, but we switch out the white and the black to play slightly different tools to kind of control the board. But overall, both decks are pretty comparable on how they operate. But now moving on to the next deck, we're going to kind of get into the top 2 of the decks that are in the meta, so let's move on to that. So now moving on to the second to last deck, we're going to go on to the Junfu deck, which is pretty much the deck that you may see going around the meta currently. So the deck's pretty straightforward, in the sense that it's pretty much oven deck with cats and stuff like that. But because Agent's gone, you can kind of get a little bit more, you can add more colors to get these effects going in. But the overall effect here is we're making food tokens, we're popping back cats in and out of the graveyard to do damage to them every time it comes into the battlefield. We are taking their things, we're sacrificing their things to either the oven or to the priest of the forgotten gods. We're adding Trail of Crumbs to give some draw here, or to kind of like scry the top of our library, also to create more food tokens. Will Strategy to give us another engine to sacrifice things and deal damage. Mayhem Devil to do additional damage every time every time something is sacrificed. Migration Path to just kind of look for a little bit of ramp. Kobold's another card that actually is another sacrifice engine. He just gets stronger and stronger every time we sacrifice something. Bolas the Citadel, because just giving us the ability to kind of scry through the top of to play cards off the top of our library, take some life, and then maybe get into that tap, sacrifice 10 non-land permanents, each opponent loses 10 life is definitely good. But overall the deck is pretty straightforward, and the fact that it runs the cats, because you tap one, play a cat. If you have a way to sacrifice it to like a Witch's Oven, which is the typical engine, you create a food from sacrificing the cat, you use that food to then replay the cat, doing the initial when it comes in the battlefield effect again. So that's the one engine there. Claim the Firstborn, we can take something that costs 3 or less, it becomes ours, we can untap it, it gains haste, we can swing in at our opponent with their own creature, and if we have a Witch's Oven out, we can always sacrifice that creature and create a food token with their creature and then get back our cat. Gilded Goose, because it creates a food token, we can tap 2 and tap it to create a food token. We can sacrifice a food, add 1 mana of any color, so we can use our foods that we're creating to produce mana to play certain cards. Definitely a solid card, and it's a 0/2 flyer, which actually becomes pretty interesting because it can block things in the air. Witch's Oven, because it allows us to sacrifice any of our creatures to create food tokens, as well as use like Mayhem Devil's effect, because whenever we sacrifice something to play something, we deal 1 damage. So just another way to sacrifice. Also creates a food, which we can always use for Kobold late in the game, because Kobold's ability makes a sacrifice permanent. So if we sacrifice food for this, combined with Mayhem Devil, we're just doing additional damage. Priest of the Forgotten Gods, it makes us sacrifice 2 creatures. Any opponent, any number of target players each lose 2 life, and then sacrifice a creature, and then we get to draw a card and gain 2 mana to then replay something maybe on our turn. Definitely Priest of the Forgotten Gods is good here because, like I said, we can take their thing from Claim the Firstborn, use it for this ability. If we claim the Firstborn, one of their creatures, use our Cauldron's Familiar plus their creature, we get 2 mana, draw a card, they lose 2 life, and on top of it, they sacrifice a creature. So that's definitely a good spot removal, especially in the decks that don't run a lot of creatures. This is definitely good because if they only have 1 or 2 creatures on the battlefield, they're really, you know, losing their creatures pretty quickly, and they don't have enough bodies to pretty much stop this effect from pretty much wiping them out in 2 turns. Trail of Crumbs, because yet again, it's actually really good for 2 costs. It comes in the battlefield, we create a food token, which can get back our Cauldron Familiar if it's somehow in the graveyard without a Witch's Oven or just got killed. Before we can play Witch's Oven, we can always get the cat back. As well as whenever we sacrifice food, we may pay 1. If we do look at the top 2 cards of our library, we get to reveal a permanent card among them, put into our hand, and the rest in the bottom of our library. So technically, we can use this to dig for things as we sacrifice things. It's definitely a good effect because it's like a scribe, but you get to pick 1 and put into your hand. Definitely a solid card. Woe Strider, because it creates a goat token. It creates another additional like engine to sacrifice creatures to use it for the Mayhem Devil, as well as we get to scry the top card of our library. So if we don't like it, if we have like the Bolas' Citadel out, we can always sacrifice a creature, scry the top card off if it's a land that we can't play, and look for something that we can play at the top. Mayhem Devil, like I said before, because whenever we sacrifice something, it deals 1 damage to any target. Definitely a solid card. Combine that with the Bolas' Citadel, this will actually make us do damage to their opponent's face when we sacrifice their 10 permanents, so we'll do 10 damage automatically, plus another 10 from the Bolas' Citadel. Definitely interesting engine. Migration Path, 4 cost, search your library for 2 basic land cards, put them on the battlefield. So for just for a little bit of ramp, also we can cycle for 2, which is definitely solid. But just that little bit of additional ramp is always good. Corvold, like I said before, it's a 5 cost 4/4, and whenever he enters the battlefield, attacks, sacrifice another permanent, so it's another thing that works with the Mayhem Devil, as well as he gets larger every time we sacrifice a permanent. The additional thing is, whenever we sacrifice a permanent in general, he actually gets a +1/+1 counter, and we draw a card. So if we're doing Cauldron Familiars on top of just playing a few things, sacrificing a few things for him, he'll just get stronger and stronger, and then we can always swing in over the top with Corvold. Definitely interesting. Bolas Citadel is kind of like that late game finish. If we play this on turn like 6 and we have a decent amount of life left because we've been gaining life with the Cauldron Familiar, we can actually start playing things off the top of our library, losing life in that process. If we get to 10 permanents on the battlefield, we can sacrifice them all and each opponent loses 10 life. So it's a good way to finish out the game, especially if our opponent's getting low from the Cauldron Familiars and other things that we're doing. Definitely a solid card there. Castle Lock 3 for a little bit of that draw. We tap 3, draw a card, we lose life equal to the number of cards in our hand. So if we're getting low, if we have like 1 to 0 cards in our hand and we've been gaining life from Cauldron Familiar, it's just a good way to kind of refill ourselves back up with a little bit of life loss. 3 swamps, 1 mountain, 3 forests, 4 blood crypts, 4 overgrown tombs, 4 stomping grounds, and 4 fabled passages. Pretty solid mana base. This deck is a little bit not as controlly, so it's only 24 lands, 21 creatures, 15 things that are non-creatures, so mixtures of sorceries, artifacts, and enchantments. But overall, this deck is pretty solid. It is another one of those decks that you will see in the meta. The other thing too is what you could run. You could always run in Gigantha, which I've seen. The only thing is you can't play Gigantha and Bolas Citadel in the same meta, in the same deck, just because Gigantha doesn't allow us to play things that have multiples of the same color symbol in its mana cost, so you'd have to either choose Gigantha and or Bolas Citadel. Gigantha can always help us with our lands. It's also a decent 5/5 body, so that's the one thing I would say what you may see is a difference, that some people run Giganthas and some people may not run Bolas Citadels. That's just the two differences from the decks. And now the last deck up is the Temur Reclamation deck. This is the deck that majority of people in the tournament are playing. It's the deck that's been proven to just work it's definitely very, very strong in a best of 3 format, just because it has a lot of abilities to pretty much negate a lot of things our opponents are going to play. It's pretty straightforward on what we want to do here. We want to get the Wilderness Reclamation out. We want to, start pumping out things that cost X with the additional mana that we're getting from every time our land's on tap. The ability that we can play things during our turn. At the end of our turn, all those lands untap, and then we get the ability to then replay things on our opponent's turn. If we get enough mana out and enough reclamations out, we can also untap. At the end of our step, we untap multiple times and cast a giant explosion at our opponent's face, maybe leaving mana open in case they counter it. But overall, this is pretty straightforward. It's very, very strong in the way that it operates. The one thing that it does, if we don't have a very strong early game to kind of spot removal things on the battlefield, it could become a very aggressive deck, could technically take this deck out. But overall, this deck from this list I'm seeing is has a very big ideas on that particular spot removal or board wipe removal to kind of slow down those like small creatures that get very wide and hit for a lot very quickly. But overall, the deck is pretty straightforward. So we start off with Ops, just to draw a card and scry, just so we can start digging a little bit deeper into our deck to get more cards. Negates for those non-creature spell counters. It's a 2-cost non-creature spell counter, so we can save it, especially if our opponent's playing a counter. Maybe they're going to save a counter for our explosion. We can save this to maybe counter their counter. Wilt for that spot removal of their target enchantment and or artifact, just because Jund Food's a thing, so it's just a spot removal for that particular deck type. Then you got Growth Spiral, which is just an additional way to ramp up, draw a card, we get to put additional land on the battlefield. Just a good solid ramp card at instant speed. Brazen Borrower to bounce something back that maybe your opponent's playing, to kind of like, be a little bit annoying, to slow your opponent down, make them have to replay it. And then we can also flash it in for a little bit of aerial threat at any time, but you can only block things with flying, so that's the only downfall. Neutralize, because why not add some more counters to counter other counters, and we can also cycle it in case our opponent's not really playing anything we want to counter. Flame Sweep to wipe out those smaller creatures on the battlefield at instant speed. 2 damage across the board into a mono red deck could be pretty big. Uro, because why not add more ramp, add some life gain, and have the ability to escape it later in case we're not really running into our expansions or expansion explosions. So definitely a solid card there. Wilderness Reclamation, this is the bread and butter of the deck. This allows our lands to be untapped. We can spend all our mana during our turn, untap them at the end of our turn, kind of slowly build up a board presence. We can cast really, really big spells that cost X. Definitely solid. Shark Typhoon, because you can play for 6. And then this is one of those decks where I think you can play for 6 and untap your lands, and especially if you're playing spells on your opponent's turns, we get sharks on their turn when we play spells. So definitely a solid card there. We can also make a very, very big shark at the end of one of our turns or something if we want to just like have this big shark on the battlefield. But overall, I think, we may still just use it as early game draw as well. But like I said, you could possibly play this as the actual shark. Expansion Explosion, because yes, this is the deck that pretty much finishes out your opponent's opponent. If you get like the perfect thing, you probably get 7 lands on the battlefield, 2 Wilderness Reclamations, or 3 Wilderness Reclamations and your opponent has, you know, tapped out or something like that, you can definitely explosion them into the face at full life and they'll just die. As well as we can tap 2, we can copy target spell, and we get to copy it if it costs 4 or less. And so if our opponent plays something against us, we can always copy it and just do it right back at them. If they counter our thing, we have this, we can counter their counter with their own counter by copying their counter. That was a lot of words. But overall, this card has great utility, but it's also one of our finishers just because we can explosion them in the face, especially with all the Wilderness Reclamations. It just allows us, and we get to draw X cards. So also, if they play a big creature, we can also explosion for X and kill that creature, and we draw 6 cards, and we refill our hand back up. Gadwick is another solid card just because we can tap X to play it, and when we tap that X additional, we get to draw X cards, so it allows us to fill up our hands even more. And then whenever we cast a blue spell, we can tap target permanent opponent control, so we can slowly tap them down. So if we have like a opt or something like that, we can slowly tap down maybe their big thing they're swinging at us or could swing at us whenever we need to. Castlevanius to scry. This is also another thing with Reclamation. You can actually scry multiple times at the end of your turn if you have enough mana open. You can tap mana, untap, tap enough to scry. If you have another Reclamation, you can untap that and have enough mana to scry again if you really are looking for an answer or just looking to finish out the game. This card is very strong with the combination of Wilderness Reclamation. 2 islands, 1 mountain, 2 forests, 4 steam vents, 3 stomping grounds, 4 breeding pools, 4 Ketras, Triones, 2 blast zones, and 3 Fabled Passages. Overall, the deck rounds out fairly strong. It's a 3.5-ish curve. We play 7 creatures, 25 non-creatures. The reason why it says 7 creatures besides the Uros is that we have the Brazen Borrowers, so that's the other 4 creatures there. 22 enchantments, 22 instances, 7 enchantments, 28 lands. This is a deck that you want to draw lands because the more lands we have, the stronger our explosion is going to be, the less reclamations we need out to kind of just finish out our opponent. But overall, this deck is solid, and there's a reason why people are playing it. It's pretty straightforward on how it works. With Reclamation, just makes our mana pool just even better because technically just doubles, triples, X amount of reclamations you have out. It just expands our mana pool at the end of our turn, which allows us to play these big explosions and stuff like that. So in closing, guys, I mean, overall, this is kind of how the meta broke down based on this tournament. This doesn't mean what you're going to see in Magic the Gathering Arena. I just figured to use that as a tool to kind of show you what the pros are playing or what the pros are bringing to bigger tournaments. In the best of 1, these decks could work. They may just need some tweaking just based on the overall meta in the actual like best of 1 meta currently in the arena. Maybe adding in some more spot removal for these more aggro decks. The one thing I will say is that based on what I've seen in like the various websites I've looked at for how the meta has been breaking down, a lot more people have gotten more aggressive with these more aggressive like aggro decks. So like you'll see a lot of mono red, you'll see things like that. So if you wanted to play any of these decks, I would say just add those additional like spot removals to kind of slow down your opponent's fast start. Enough. With that being said, guys, these lists will be in some form or way down at the bottom of the description. So if you want to check out any of these links and import them into MTG Arena, feel free to do so. If you guys like this video, hit that like button. If you want to know when I post more videos, hit that subscribe button. I will catch you in the next video.